García Quiñones. Sorry.
It's okay.
Quiñones. Her talk will be on Vernon's hearers and listeners, their contemporary reception and place in the history of the experimental psychology of music.
I have shortened it up because it was too long. Thank you.
Yes.
So thank you for being here. As you can see, I have shortened up a little bit the title, also because I have kind of reframed it a little bit because I thought I had to explain this character. I have to explain who Vernon Lee is for a start, so this is going to take a little bit of time. I was thinking, I heard this morning twice the sentence, this presentation is a springboard, and I thought, well, I'm going to steal that because it kind of makes you feel like you're going to get higher ground, but I don't really know if I'm going to get any higher ground. So I would just say this is an exploratory presentation, so it's a springboard or not, I don't know yet. So I kind of met Vernon Lee's work while doing research about music listening, which is my field, and I found this name once, not very often, but I was intrigued. And so this is an attempt to see particularly one of his works, her work, sorry, the last big work that's quite big, yes, it's this one, that she published, which was called Music and Its Lovers, and it's based on her survey of different, I will talk about that. So questions about basically listening habits. So Vernon Lee is not one that you would find in principle in a conference like this, because she's mainly known as a writer of ghost stories and fantastic tales, and you will find her works in anthologies of Victorian tales or even decadent tales or ghost stories, as I said. So that's what you find mainly when you look for her work. She's also well known as a thinker on aesthetic topics, visual art, and also music, which is what I'm going to focus on. And she's not that known as a psychologist, because she wasn't really a psychologist, but she was somebody who, as I'm going to explain, was very active in kind of being updated about psychology, and also corresponded with important psychologists and experimental psychologists of her time. So she was born in France, but she came from, I'm not going to tell her whole story, but just some pieces that are necessary to know who she was. She was born in France, in an unconventional family. Her mother was a widow, and her father was a tutor, and she never she didn't have like a formal education, but she was from a very early age encouraged to study and educate herself. In the family there was a lot of reading, a lot of commenting. They were friends with the surgeon, so she was from very early age going to art galleries and museums, and at a certain point they settled in Florence. First they were in France, then they came to Florence, and so there's a villa near Florence. That's there was a home in Palmerino, was a cultural association that keeps also her memory and legacy alive. And she started as a writer of art history and also music history, because her first work, which was a success, was the studies of the 18th century in Italy, and it dealt with the music as well. And so she was part of the Water Circle, and published different, mainly fiction works, but also from a very early age aesthetic works as well. And also travel, that's also important in her production, travel books. She traveled a lot. She went to Morocco, Spain, she hated. Then she was constantly, spending summers in London and living, in the last part of her life, mainly in Florence, also taking care of her brother. Then, regarding music, which is going to be the main topic of this presentation, as I said, her most important work is Music and its Lover, but it's also worth mentioning an article that she published, The Riddle of Music, which was a kind of review of some of the most important works in the psychology of music, including and aesthetics, Hanslick and Edward Gurney, The Power of Sound, and other contemporary works. And she also, regarding aesthetics, the beauty and ugliness is one of the, and I'm going to talk about that. That's a collaboration with Keith Answorth Thompson, which was a dear friend of her and a partner as well. So, as I was telling you, she was mainly known for, I've said that already, and also one important point of her work as an aesthetic thinker is the fact that she popularized the term empathy, which is a translation of the German Einfühlung. So if you take this history of empathy, published by Susan Lanzoni some years ago, you will find that she talks about the importance of Vernon as a, popularizing this term. So, but what she says is also something that I want to reflect on, because she describes Vernon as the amateur psychologist, novelist, and travel writer. Vernon wrote extensively on aesthetic empathy for English-speaking audiences, and by the middle of the 20th century, psychologists proved the nature of Einfühlung. Was it an actual bodily imitation or an imagined mimicry? These are terms that we're going to see later on. Did it take place in the mind or the muscles? How did one project feelings and movements into objects of contemplation? That's one big topic for her. But you see, she's described here as an amateur psychologist, and that's the first question that I want to bring to the table. Like, when can we talk about somebody as a professional? Of course, she was not in academia. She was not formally educated. Her brother had the opportunity to go to the university, but she didn't. So she was certainly part of the intellectual conversation of the day. She was friends with, or met William James. Maybe he wasn't really exactly. He has some popular description of her, somebody who was dangerous, because she was very. She had a sharp mind. She was in a network of intellectual exchanges, also including German psychologists, Oscar Kulpe. She visited his experimental laboratory and studied the works of William James, as I mentioned, Theodore Leaves, Karl Lange, Theodore Rigaud, Karl Gross, Oswald Kulpe, Giuseppe Sergi. She wrote for scholarly magazines. Some of her essays were reviewed also in scholarly magazines. She didn't teach, right? Gave lectures, and she sometimes gave lectures at universities. So, of course, that part of the familiarity with the psychology of the day was very important, as I'm going to tell you, for her writings on the psychology of music. But I want to kind of ask the larger question, that goes beyond she herself as a figure. Who do we have to include in the conversations about a field? And in the case of a woman, that's it's a pressing question, because at the time it was really exceptional that women would have a formal education. but she was certainly part of the intellectual world as well. So she didn't have the resources of a laboratory, and we will see there's some limits to what she managed to do at the time. But there are also criticisms of what the kind of research that she did. But maybe it's important also that we take into consideration these kind of figures that are not easy to frame, they're not easy to, they're a bit sitting uncomfortably between different chairs. But I think also that having like a discourse that it's really interesting. So that's these limitations, she herself could see them when after she had been visiting this laboratory of Oswald Kulpe at the University of Bonn. She wrote this in the preface to Beauty and Ugliness, which was is probably her main written in collaboration with Clementine and Thompson. That's like the main work on visual aesthetics, not music, where they try different ways to understand what kind of also physical effects visual works could have, which is something, it sounds a bit strange, and they really went into a lot of detail, using mainly her friend Thompson as kind of subject, or experimental subject, trying to understand how certain views or sculptures could have a physical effect, physiological effect on different parts of the body. It's something sounds a bit strange, but they try to understand because of this idea of empathy. They thought that there was a kind of communication or way to movement towards the work of art that had to do with physical effects to that. And of course, this has also roots in the theory of William James about emotion. So there are reasons for that. But when she presented this work, she kind of restricted her role in a way, saying that she had been there at the University of Bonn and had come away with the conviction not only that there's in the laboratory is a future way of studying aesthetics, but also that is the way in which, alas, I can never hope to study them. I mean, she doesn't say exactly why, but of course, a laboratory is an institutional structure, so it's not something that you can really have at home. Aesthetics will always be those of the gallery and the studio, not of the laboratory. Maybe there's a matter also of personal choice here. They will never achieve scientific certainty. They will be based, so meaning her observations on observation rather than experiment, and they will remain for the reason conjectural and suggestive. So she's kind of restricting her field, but at the same time claiming also a link to what was going on in Europe and in Bonn, and that was like the avant-garde of experimental psychology. So that's Beauty and Ugliness, a really interesting work. But we're going to focus on, as I said, on her music studies. And here, these guys have got how he is doing research on her music writings, but mainly, I mean, he's not doing what I'm trying to do. He's mainly looking, I mean, doing a couple of work, looking into the books that she read, that they are in, some of them are in Florence, looking into her common place books, into all kind of annotations that she made while reading response research. The main part of that material is in Maine, in the Colby College, so that's interesting. But I'm seeking to publish works, not I'm not going to go into material. But he has done that work, and he says that there's a problem with increasing demarcation and separation of fields of scholarship during the period in which the establishment of formal bodies was encouraged, and so in that intellectual landscape, she remained inclusive, comparative, pluralist, and interdisciplinary. So she was, in a way, reacting to a time in which many disciplines were being formed and establishing boundaries and getting stronger as well, but trying to have a strong basis on which to build on. But she was not part of that, and that's part of, I think, the attractive of what she did. So, music and its lovers, published in 1933 for the American edition. She died only 3 years later, so it was like the end of her life. And in the preface, she writes that she tries to understand while the self-same music will perhaps seem good for worth having to some people, and bad not worth having to others. So they use also the spirit of tastes, the interest of explaining them, those tastes, and describes the book describes the various kinds of response, emotional and imaginative, and even musical to music, and attempts to account for these being thus various. So that's a work on the individual differences in music, which is a concept that some other psychologists have used to do this kind of work, and also a work on responses to music or effects of music. These are terms also used by other music psychologists. She says it is a book on aesthetics, but aesthetics as a branch of psychology, so that's also important. And this was based on answers to a questionnaire of which there were 3 versions, and then we go a little bit into the kind of material production of this book. So this questionnaire, which is kind of not a new method, at the time there were questionnaires for anthropologists were using the questionnaires. The very first, well, the comparative musicologists also were using that. Of course, psychologists, all the psychologists at the time were using them. And there were 3 versions of this questionnaire: a shorter one in English and French that circulated in TypeScript among Lee's friends and acquaintances. So you can imagine this is not the idea of a universal research. This is a questionnaire that circulated mainly among educated people. So that gives you an idea of what kind of research is that. There's one of the limitations is that, of course. And there was then another version, a longer one in German, published by the Zeitschrift für Ästhetik in 1907. And this one reached a large audience, and here she didn't have that much control on who was responding. But these questionnaires were sent to 150 people. As I said, some personal friends of Vernon. Vernon is her nom de plume, so her real name was Violet Page. Others chosen at random, and mainly they seek information on their musical background. There was like questions 1 to 4, questions like, have you learned to play or sing? Have you learned through us? Can you read music? So different questions from 1 to 4 to establish what kind of musical background that person had. And then you had other questions, for instance, reading number 5, while listening to or remembering music without words or suggestive title, are you apt to think of it as expressing human emotion? And A, as if the composer were telling you his own inner drama. B, as if he were telling you the inner drama of some third person, back or otherwise. And C, as if the music were somehow the expression of your own feelings. So you see this kind of a bit of maybe a naive tone in this kind of detail that in some cases complicated the answers because sometimes they didn't exactly understand the word, what she meant. 2 minutes? Oh. So, thank you. So, there was a strong focus on memory and on emotion. But the production was very difficult because, of course, in the end you end up with lots of different answers in different languages as well. So it took her like 20 years to put not of continuous work, of course. After there was a war between the First World War, so she resumed work, and so he tried to kind of put an order to this chaos, and finally published this book, where she expands on actually she uses these answers to kind of weave these courses. It's not so much kind of quantifying in any way the answers. We don't know exactly when these people listen to music or what kind of music they listen to. We don't even know what kind of whether they listen to phonographs or it was just only prefer music. I mean, I have to look into that, and I cannot see that because one important thing is that at that time, music psychology was already moving to experimenting with recordings, not with live music. Even there was a period in which there was people performing in experiments, but then at that point they had already moved. So there's introspection, which was quite common at that time, and the answers were not anonymized. Some they appear with their family name. So there was some methodological issues that I'm going to kind of pass about, but the main thing is there was this distinction between hearers and listeners that had already appeared in the varieties of music listening, which was the first chapter of the book, but then that she complicates further, indicating that the distinction between hearers and listeners is not clean-cut. So she is sometimes quoted as somebody who has classified listeners between hearers and listeners, but actually there's much more to that in this book. Also, the distinction between passive and active attention is not that clear. She understands that hearers can become listeners, that there's a certain degree of listening in all hearing, and also the opposite. And there's also important developments regarding the body that are not exactly based on the answers that she got, but that whether she's putting forward a theory of inner mimicry to understand how the kind of effect music can have on us. So I'm cutting this short, and yeah, that's mainly one of the points that I wanted to make is this phonographic listening, is this always real listening, because part of what was done in music psychology was already done with records, because there was an interest also from companies like the Edison company for recordings to be used also in kind of psychological experiments, and also because they provided a kind of a standardization of the listening situation. So as you see, I see many ways that can be possibly explored, and I hope to have the chance to do that. And thank you for your attention.
My question for you is this: is there any relation with the difference between the listeners and the hearers, and the ancient Greek difference between the awake and sleeper, Parmenide, for example? Is there any evidence about that?
I would say no, because I think, I mean, you can of course you can draw this parallel, but I don't think it really, she would never put in those terms. Also because what she's trying to do while recognizing this difference is also complicating it, like saying, and at a certain point she says that there's listening, hearing, and hearing and listening, in the way that this is not a hierarchy, and that's what makes different the way that she reads from other Hanslick or other thinkers. Like, she's not saying if you're a hearer you can become a listener. No, she's saying, well, you're a listener because you pay attention. The first time maybe that you're not familiar with a certain musical work, you are more, you have to put more of that effort to understand, but maybe when you are familiar with that, she's not saying exactly that, but that's what I understand that she implies, you may also listen to that work as a hearer, or even overhear that. So it's not really like, and to me this is the most, it's not, I mean, there is the possibility of distinction, and she does that, but then I think this to me the most interesting thing is the way that then she complicates it with other reasonings. The book is divided in one part where she talks about the listeners, but when she talks about listeners, she also talks about things that are not exactly, attentive listening. And also when she talks about hearers, she's not talking about different people. And also probably the fact that she's not quantifying, she's not doing like mass observation, or she's only kind of working with answers from people that belong to her same social class. So she's not really condemning or making a kind of clear distinction, like one's the upper way to listen, or the good way or the ideal way, and the other one is a bad way or a degenerate way, as other thinkers have done. So I think it's probably because I think one of the points is that she's deaf friends. So it's different if a friend tells you that has a variety of experiences with music than if you see that as a social issue. Like the people that don't know, they're not educated enough to understand something, maybe they're trying to, or they pretend they understand or they are into something that they are not. So there's not, because we're talking about the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the first century, she's a character that is kind of in between, before modernism. So, I mean, Virginia Woolf respected her, but it's something different already. So it's kind of in between. So I don't think this kind of work.
Okay, thank you. Any other question?
This is maybe more comment. I mean, one thing that strikes me is that the dynamics of hearing and listening maybe take a particular form in English that's different from the form they take in other languages, which I would be interesting to think about. And the other is that you know, I'm doing some work on the surrealist metaphor of taking dictation, and there are other sites where in corporate offices and other places where dictation is taken, that listening well means listening in a kind of absent-minded way, inattentively. And so it's interesting to think about how much the dynamics are shaped by the context in which listening happens.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Yeah, I don't think, because she's not a thinker of like the modern world in technology, but and these the kind of phenomena you describe is more some spectrums of attention by Jonathan Perry and things like that, like this kind of. But she starts to see that that the difference is not that clear. It's blurred, and I think it's exactly so. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I would like to know a little more about the use of empathy in these observations in gallery. Can you tell us something more about this?
Thank you. That part is, I mean, I'm not an expert, but only on visual arts, but that part is fascinating. And there are annotations by her that she by herself of gallery, visit to galleries, where she was trying to kind of take note of everything that she felt, which kind of difficult, but at the same time, like trying to see, perceive, and kind of having a flow of conscience that she tried to record for that. That was when Keith and Truett Thompson was not associated with her anymore, but the thing started with Keith and Truett Thompson, which was an artist, and Vernon considered her like a motor type, so somebody who was particularly apt or thought in motor ways. It was a kind of personality description that she attached to her. And so what they did is, going to galleries and trying to register that kind of even very tiny sensation that she was having, looking, they were in Italy, so there was a lot of art to watch. So they were trying to understand how it worked, so how a certain sculpture could provoke or some kind of physiological sensation. But in the end, this woman who was doing that kind of couldn't do that anymore. I mean, she was exhausted, and the relationship fell out because there was a lot of stress also in doing this kind of work. One being like the experimental subject for the other one, or I mean, they were doing that together, but the role of experimental subject was more rather Clementine or Keith and Phil Thompson, who was kind of doing that. And so the main concept is that of empathy, and I think the way it they describe this, they relate emotion and action and movement, even if there is also an evolution in the way that Vernon thought about that, because at the beginning she thought in terms more of action, and then more in terms of inner action, or maybe there was no really like nothing happening, but it was something going on in the imagination. It was kind of, but if you think of mirror neurons, maybe there's a connection to that. Like there's something that you do, and in your mind you can, since you know how to do that, or how that action is done, or how that gesture, because it's also very much about gesture, how it works, you can connect to that as well, and it kind of allows you to feel that. But the concept comes from lips, but there's more like a practical way to kind of and going into detail, trying to understand how these work in particular situations of observing and kind of perceiving and enjoying art. But I'm not an expert, so yeah.
Yes.
Okay, this is my last question, please.
Okay, so there was another question?
No.
Yours is the last question.
Give her the phone.
No, it's in relation with this question. When she works with music, is she also interested in these kind of body reactions, physiological reactions?
The funny thing is that in the questionnaire there's no part where that mentions physiology, but then in the book that is based on those answers, but at the same time she's using those answers in a way that's quite free. She kind of uses one real answer and then one declaration by Andrew Thompson to introduce a whole chapter that is, I mean, it's more like developments, because these answers, sometimes she would interview people. So some of the answers are in written, most of them, but sometimes he would interview people, and then she would get more detail into kind of particular situations of listening to music or listening to a particular work. And so I don't know why she didn't include these in the questions. Maybe there was a moment where she was, I don't know, moving on or wanted to move on from this empathy, because empathy really is not that present in this book. I mean, wow. It's kind of come on like a couple of times only. But then you have a whole chapter on this inner mimicry, and then other mentions of this physiological part to that.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I would like to know exactly why. I mean, because if you have a questionnaire and you have been working on this regarding visual art, why don't you put at least one question about this? So
interesting.
I don't have an answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Around 1910, there was a very strong revolution in music. Yes, Aldenberg, the coming up of Stravinsky, that changed the whole world of sounds. And what was the influence on this lady and her idea of music, of beautiful?
I haven't read. She was somebody who was updated, but that was not her subject. This revolution, she wrote and was strongly against Wagner. So she was from a previous. At a certain point, especially during the Great War, she was more into political issues, like pacifist, for animal rights, and I haven't. As I said, I'm just starting. So maybe she wrote something that I'm not aware of. I mean, she had a lot of essays, but what I have, and actually in the questionnaire because the questionnaire was worked out before, so it was 20 years in the making, so there was no question about that. There was one question about tastes, and she's asking about Beethoven, Mozart, and Wagner. Wagner was really somebody who, she had really very many objections about the way that, how he changed music, and so I don't have an answer for you yet, sorry.
So her theory is old-fashioned.
Yeah, in a way it is, but at the same time I think there are elements that are worth, otherwise I wouldn't be presenting her.
Okay.
It is old-fashioned, but maybe she wrote something that I don't know of, so it's possible. I'm not saying she didn't, but it was not one of her kind of main topics, this avant-garde music. She was strongly against Wagner, and towards the end of her life, of course, she worked on that because there was something that had been in the making for many years, and she really wanted to get rid of that material. After we had a lot of, you can imagine, it's boxes of answers that she kind of struggled to connect. But she was kind of moving towards more political subjects towards the end, and mainly because of the work.
Is it not a little bit strange that you forget to make the break in the musical development and aesthetics?
I will think of that. For next presentation, I will do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's close the session.